All right, Charlotte, you can stop the sharing the screen, and we will be able to start in a few minutes. 2 seconds. Shai, you have the floor. You're muted. You're muted, Shai. Just unmute yourself.
Right.
Yes.
Yep. That's it. Thank you, Pascaline. Good morning, our friends in the United States. Good afternoon in Europe. Good evening in Israel. Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's virtual conference, 100 years after the San Remo conference, in search for new paradigm for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. My name is Shai Bazak. I am the CEO of Elnet Israel. Elnet is a non-profit organization dedicated to strengthening relations between Europe and Israel based on our shared democratic values and strategic interests. I want to acknowledge our very important guest this evening here with us, Minister Orit Farkash, which will speak right after I will finish my opening remarks here. Brigadier General Mike Herzog, which will moderate the event. Ambassador Dennis Ross, I didn't see you for a few years already. Welcome. Ambassador Arik Danon, Dr. Tal Becker, Ambassador Ned Segal, thank you for joining us, and many other distinguished guests. Today's event is the third in a series dedicated to the centenary of the San Remo conference, which was convened in 1920 by the post-World War members of the Allied Supreme Council to decide the fate of the former Ottoman Empire territories. In one of the key events in the history of international recognition of the Jewish people's right to self-determination in the only place which had ever served in their ancestral homeland. I remember that it was very famous phrase of the first president of the state of Israel, Chaim Weizmann, who defined the event of the San Remo is the event that practically was the state of Israel was born. I guess the distinguished representatives who sat in the lovely San Remo in Italy 100 years and 5 months ago didn't imagine that 100 years later, we're all going to sit in 3 different continents, hundreds of people discussing the historic outcome of their conference, especially speaking to a small screens, each one of us in his own office or home, and are able to exchange views. But history, as you know, is very interesting. In today's events, we bring together European, Israelis, and US policymakers and experts to discuss the unresolved Israeli-Palestinian conflict, drawing on historical, diplomatic, and political perspective. A couple of technical notes before we begin. Please note that this event is on the record and is streamed live on our website and Facebook. You are muted upon entry. Please stay muted so all participants can hear the speakers clearly. If you would like to ask questions to the speakers, and in particular to Minister Farkash-Hacohen, who will need to leave early, please write them in the chat box, and the Elnet team will make sure to bring them to the attention of the moderator. We will begin with opening remarks by Minister Orit Farkash-Hacohen, Israel's Minister of Strategic Affairs, followed by short Q&A before moving to the discussion with our distinguished speakers, moderated, as I said, by Brigadier General Mike Herzog. I just want to introduce Minister Farkash-Hacohen, which is a member of Knesset for the Blue and White Alliance. Prior to that, she was the chairwoman of Israel Electricity Authority, as well as legal advisor, a lawyer by profession. Minister Farkash-Hacohen worked for several legal firms, the Supreme Court, and the Antitrust Authority. Thank you all for joining us. and Orit, which is a good friend too. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Shai. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Shalom from Jerusalem. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to start by thanking Elnet for organizing this special event and allowing me to address this important issue and respected audience. Alongside the problematic coronavirus that we are all facing today, Israel is also witnessing another chapter in its success story. 2 weeks ago, we witnessed a shift towards normalization and prosperity and peace between Israel and the Arab world, as we signed a peace accords with the Emirates and Bahrain. When this conference was convened, I was asked to speak about possible paradigm shifts. Well, we are witnessing one of the largest shifts imaginable today. The region is progressing from divestment to dialogue and from boycotting to cooperation. These days, the ideas of prosperity, peace are no longer being held hostage by the Palestinian issue. We stand ready to join hands with moderate, practical Arab countries against terror, extremism, and aggression. Since its inception, Israel has sought peace. This has always been a key pillar in our national identity. We wish to see all our neighbors, including the Palestinians, join us to advance this issue. This will be done by looking forward towards cooperation and normalization. I hope that the regional changes can allow us to reignite our talks with the Palestinians based on the ideas outlined in the Abraham Accords. Now, surprisingly, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, and members of the anti-Israel delegitimization campaign came out against the peace and the normalization loudly and strongly. They came out against the new paradigm because while it provides hope and a bright future to many in the region, it is determined to the outdated paradigm hate cycle. The new world we are witnessing didn't start yesterday. It is a process in many ways linked to the San Remo currents in the international arena 100 years ago. The League of Nations gave a legal grounding to the idea of Jewish nation state in the land of Israel. From then until now, it has been an uphill struggle. It is astonishing how central the outcome of the San Remo conference to the fight Israel and its friends is waging in the international arena today. Because of this, it is mind-boggling how such a legal and historic asset is left unknown to so many, including practitioners, diplomats, and others. Google it. Try to find references for it in major speeches through the years, in curriculums or explanations in Israeli-Arab conflict and other sources. It is very hard to find the San Remo reference. How is it possible? Well, as I hinted before, some of the responsibility for the San Remo's absence from the public discourse lies with us, Israelis and friends of Israel around the world. We neglected to tell the story of this conference time and time again, enabling the void to be filled with lies and hate. If we don't tell the story of the San Remo conference, who will? If we don't remind the world that the League of Nations and then the United Nations made this decision, who will? When we don't tell our story and set the record straight, we cannot expect anyone else to do it on our behalf. If this is the case, we cannot be surprised when people rewrite history and distort it. Today, we are shifting paradigms. Israel's peace with the Emirates and Bahrain was an important and historic step. Another crucial, in order to build our future, we must reclaim our past so that every person in any country understands the legal basis for the Jewish nation state here in Israel. Israel faces an ongoing delegitimization campaign of hate, lies, and incitement. We are fighting it at the so-called UN Human Rights Council, in many petitions to the International Criminal Court, and of course, out in the open on social media platforms. From San Remo until today, we have not only a moral case, but also a legal case. And we must not forget this. Ever since entering my ministry, we have focused on the social networks and media platforms because of hate speech, is rapidly increasing. This is a field which needs to be dealt with using wide range of tools. My ministry has a government task force talking to Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, only today with Google. We have made it clear that we will not accept calls for removal of the state of Israel from maps, whether it is made by BDS activists or by Iranian leadership. Social networks have a great deal of responsibility, and we will hold them accountable for the content they allow their users to consume. Just as Israel is building the world of tomorrow with its neighbors, so can the social networks build the worlds of tomorrow with us. A world in which they will not allow incitement or the glorification of terror to be masked as freedom of speech. Harsh disagreements, of course, criticism, of course, but calling for Israel's destruction, never. As the time needs, I repeat my point. First, we are witnessing a new paradigm. This is not a theory, it's a reality. We must strive for legitimization and normalization with all countries, near and far. Second, we must encourage the memories and to use it with all the tools and to fight against the legitimization. I want to wish all of you Shana Tova and a good health and shalom. I want each and every person of you to partner with us and to be part of this fight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Orit Farkash-Hacohen. I'm Mike Herzog, Director of the Forum of Strategic Dialogue, and I will moderate this discussion. And since you have to leave a bit early, I would like to ask you a follow-up question on matters of policy. You spoke about a paradigm shift as represented by the recent breakthrough towards normalization with some of the Arab states. Now, talking to people in our government, I hear two schools of thought on how this might impact the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Because 100 years after San Remo, we have a thriving state, but an unresolved conflict with the Palestinians. One school of thought contends that we should focus on expanding the circle of normalization in the region and not at this phase invest in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict other than basic stabilization. And ultimately, when the circle of peace expands, the Palestinians will come round. Maybe the future leadership, we don't know. But there is another school of thought that says that we should use the new normalization with the Arabs, not as a bypass, but as a bridge towards the Palestinians to open space to Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking, or at least improving the situation. Where do you stand on this policy debate?
Thank you for the question. I totally stand on the last, let's put it, you called it a two-askola on the latter. And I also just pronounced it and said it in the words that I gave. I think that this is an opportunity to reignite the talks with the Palestinians and to create a new atmosphere in the region. We need our partners to believe in that, because, you know, up until lately, the Palestinians used the sovereignty issue as an excuse to stop talking to us, to stop collecting their own taxes from the Israeli system, punishing only their own public, and so on and so on. And now the sovereignty issue, at least for now, is off the table. And there is this new a series of normalization agreements with our neighbors. So times are changing. There are talks about Lebanon and talks about other countries. And I'm calling our neighbors to reignite that. There is no excuse for boycotts, for putting most of their energy today at ICC, at boycotts, at collaborating with the Hamas. I think they should change their paradigm as well and talk to us and create a dialogue, and to use the idea that we as Israelis are now partnering with moderate and practical countries that basically are empathic to their wishes and can create a ground for deliberation, they should see that as an opportunity. Instead, digging in their footsteps in and sticking to their, not talking to us and being very angry about these changes will not change the reality. I think that a great characteristic of a leader is to understand the shifts in time and to adapt itself to what happens. And I think that there are many, many opportunities and upsides to these changes that can create cooperation and dialogue and process through normalization rather than through conflict.
Thank you very much for that. And one more brief follow-up question before I move on to Dennis. As you know, ELNET is an organization dedicated to the relations between Israel and Europe. And there are many open policy issues between Israel and Europe. And given the new breakthrough between Israel and the region, where would you like to see Europe on this?
With regards to supporting the new dialogue, I think that Europe, and it was a worldwide support of these processes. And like I mentioned in my speech, it is not only words that I wrote down to bring my message to you. It was only the negative boycotting organization which really cried out, why is this happening? And to those, my message is that this is the way to push forward. And with regards to Europe, I have, a personal wish as an Israeli, but also as a minister who's being exposed, and also as a security cabinet minister in the Israeli government who's been exposed to what's going on at the ICC, the International Criminal Court, in other bodies of the EU, for example, if we're talking about the blacklist that the UN published, many in the support of European countries. I think that the general attitude of Europe towards Israel should also learn from this paradigm shift. And I think that Europe should also start and build on how to push forward through dialogue and cooperation, and through have a better understanding of the Israeli concerns and worries, instead of taking, sometimes we feel that this is the case, the voices, the extreme voices, when I see it in my ministry, when I see them supporting and financing and using European tax money for activities of organizations that are being presented as human rights organization, but on the other hand is supporting terror, or as another example is being biased with regards to when we look at the International Criminal Court, for that matter, instead of fighting ISIS, fighting IDF soldiers and Israel's right to defend itself. And I think that this shift, this new paradigm, based, of course, on the San Remo, among other rights that we have to have our own state, our own homeland, this is the way to go. And this change is happening, whether Europe likes it or not, whether the Palestinian likes it or not. And it is built on a coalition of moderate and pragmatic voices in the Middle East. And it is gradually isolating the terror voices and the extremists. So I think that Europe should ask itself which side of the history it wants to be part of. And I think my answer is very clear.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to give the floor now to our other speakers, and I'll get back to you if you are still with us after they speak, because we have some questions also from the audience to you. So let me now turn to my friend Dennis Ross. Dennis, please.
Look,
unfortunately, I will have to leave. Thank you again. It's great respect, and thank you for having me. Shana Tova.
Thank you very much. Chag Sameach. Dennis, please.
Okay, I do think that what Minister Hacohen identified as a new paradigm is right. There's something that is happening in the region, and we should also understand it hasn't just happened overnight. The reality is, I'll tell a kind of interesting story that reflects how things have been changing for some time. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice in 2007 made a decision that because the image of the United States at that time, in light of the war in Iraq, was so negative in the region, she decided she would change it, or sought to change it, by launching a major initiative to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. She felt this would have a kind of resonance, it could change the perception of who we are and so forth. This is 2007. She went to visit the Gulf Cooperation Council states. There are 6 Arab states: Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, and Kuwait. And she went to explain to them that she was, and with great enthusiasm, she was going to launch an initiative on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And she later wrote about how none of them were interested. She thought they would be very enthusiastic, and all they wanted to do was to hear about Iran and also what else we were going to do in Iraq. And it was kind of a reminder to her that even though she was going to pursue this, the region had a different set of priorities, or those in the region had a different set of priorities. The Emiratis and others have been developing a relationship with Israel for more than the last decade because they saw common threats, both coming from Iran and the Iranian proxies, but also coming from Sunni radical Islamists as well, whether it was Al-Qaeda or ISIS, the Muslim Brotherhood. So there was a converging strategic set of interests and concerns. In addition, there was a perception that Israel actually could be a bulwark against the threats that were a source of great concern to so many of the Sunni Arab states. So the process of normalization isn't something that just began with the August 13th between Israel and the Emirates. The interesting thing is that the Emirates made a decision to take what was an evolving relationship and make it a public one. But there were already signs of this appearing in public. You go back to 2015 when the Emiratis allowed Israel to create a diplomatic office in Abu Dhabi as part of the International Renewable Energy Agency. Sports competitions included Israeli athletes. The Minister of Culture and Sport for Israel went to the Emirates. There was an increasing level of activity that was being seen in public. There was much more that was being seen or not being seen below the radar screen. So the interesting thing is what triggered the move to cross that threshold. And ironically, the main trigger was the decision of Prime Minister Netanyahu and declaration to pursue extending Israeli sovereignty to the territories allotted to it in the Trump peace plan. The Emirates could have continued on the path they were on, but they looked at the issue of annexation as being something that could trigger, I'm not saying that they knew for sure it would trigger, but something that could trigger a backlash of anger in the region. And that Turkey and Iran, the countries seen as being the main threats, I mentioned Turkey as well as Iran, and that they would seek to exploit this and put the Emirates and others on the defensive. So they made the decision to cross the threshold. And in making the decision to cross that threshold, they created a linkage. It tends to be missed in all the discussion. They created a linkage. The linkage was, we will normalize with Israel, but Israel has to take a step towards the Palestinians, or in this case, not take a step towards the Palestinians. They linked their behavior to an Israeli move or non-move on the Palestinians. Now, I'm making this point for 2 reasons to deal with this issue of the new paradigm. The first part of this paradigm is that the strategic landscape in the region has changed. Most Sunni Arab leaderships look at Israel as a natural strategic partner, partly because they have increasing doubts about America's staying power in the region, and they know Israel is part of the region, partly because they see that Israel has capabilities, and those capabilities are significant in terms of countering or limiting the threats that are posed by Iran and the Shia militias, but also by the Muslim Brotherhood, ISIS, and so forth. So that's one dimension of the strategic reality and the new landscape. The other dimension, though, that gets the concept of a new paradigm is that there is a linkage still being made by these Sunni Arab states to the Palestinian issue. It hasn't disappeared. But the message they're sending to the Palestinians is, we can't wait for you. You don't get to freeze the region. We have national security interests that will be served by having a relationship with Israel. We have commercial interests that will be served by having a relationship with Israel. We have health relationships that will be served by having a relationship with Israel. And you don't get to deny us the ability to do that. We will, for our part, try to take steps with the Israelis that can be helpful to you. You, of course, have to be prepared to take advantage of it. In the case of the UAE, they stopped the annexation. It's off the table. Whatever is being said, it's off the table. With the Trump administration, it's clearly off the table. Trump has said as much. If Biden were to win, he's been opposed to it, so for sure it's off the table. Other Arab states can draw lessons from this in terms of saying, okay, if we take a step towards Israel in public, let's see what steps Israel might take towards the Palestinian. The point is, this, in the words of Shimon Peres, this is a new Middle East. It's too bad that he's not alive today to see what he foresaw years ago when Oslo was launched. Anybody who thinks that this would have happened had there not been the Oslo process, again, go back and look at when many of these states began to create some relations with Israel, even below the radar screen. So yes, there's an evolution here. Yes, it reflects what is a new strategic landscape in the region. The Palestinian issue is there not as something that determines what everybody else can do, and the Palestinians have to adjust to that, and they haven't shown any ability yet to do it, but I think the realities will force some adjustment. And yes, from an Israeli standpoint, Palestinians are still there. You can't wish them away. They're not going to disappear. So there is an interest in finding a way to do something with the Palestinians. And I do believe, and you said it, Mike, in describing the two different points of view within the Israeli government, those who believe that the Arab states can be a bridge to the Palestinians have an understanding of what is necessary, both for the region and I think for Israeli interest. Those who think that you can just ignore the Palestinians and just focus on the Arabs and sooner or later the Palestinians will come around, ignore what may happen in the meantime with the Palestinians. Further radicalization or even a collapse of the Palestinian Authority, neither of these would be in Israel's interest.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Let me move now to Ambassador Eric Danon. The floor is yours.
Okay, microphone is on. It's okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you, first of all. Hello, everybody. I commend Elnet for the tireless work that they are doing to promote French-Israeli relations on one side and for organizing this series of meetings to mark the anniversary of the San Remo conference 100 years ago. Just a personal note on San Remo. My great uncle was a participant of the conference at San Remo in the Zionist delegation, and in his personal notes, I could read that there was especially a great doubt as for the continuation, the follow-up of this conference. You know, it was not so obvious because the conference was a preparatory conference to that of Sèvres, which would confirm the end of the Ottoman Empire in the same year. So we're seeing the success of the San Remo conference and declaration today, but just to say that it was not so obvious at this time, and there was doubt about what was going to happen. That said, we are now in a new paradigm for the region. And for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what are the main parameters we need to factor in today? And I think that part of the answer to that question lies in the Abraham Accords themselves, agreement themselves, and in the reasons for each side to sign them. And what are these reasons? As Dennis say, first reason, the threat posed by Iran to regional stability, which raises a growing number of countries and creates de facto joint interests for Israel and some of the Gulf countries, which see the Iranian issue as their top priority. So the new reality implies to rethink traditional positions and alliances for numerous entities in the region. The second reason, the necessity for every country in the region to develop ambitious and, I should say, mutually beneficial economic cooperation. The economic expectation will continue to grow in the coming post-corona years, almost in the entire Middle East. And the third reason, the fear that many international actors, and especially Arab states, expressed regarding the prospect of a unilateral implementation of Israeli sovereignty on parts of the West Bank. So the fact that the project is now off the table, as it has been said, for a certain period of time, and has opened new perspectives for dialogue in the region. And so when you take a broader perspective on these different reasons, you might have the core principles of new paradigm for ending the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Collective security benefiting both Israel and the Arabs, prosperity and economic opportunities for all, and the rejection, I should say, of unilateral solutions for a long-lasting peace in the region. So the Abraham agreements are a game changer because they make it possible to envision a normalization of relations between Israel and a growing number of Arab countries. Fine, okay, but so far, how do they change the situation with regard to the Israeli-Palestinian issue? It's not so simple. And I could talk about 6 or 7 elements, but I will focus on 3 only. 3 elements which must be taken into account. First, these agreements take away a lever for the Palestinians. Indeed, the doctrine has been broken, according to which the normalization of relations between Israel and the Arab countries could only be done if the Israeli-Palestinian conflict received a solution. So the breaking of the doctrine, and moreover by the Arab countries themselves, deprives the Palestinians of their position as a lock on normalization. Then the Abraham agreements, second point, will lead the Sunni countries to reposition themselves in their commitment to the Palestinians. And we can see in the statement at the UN for the last 10 days that they all reiterate the need to find a solution to the conflict, but not one has offered anything concrete in this direction. So we see a kind of paradox. While we live in a world where all problems are interconnected, the Abraham agreements could disconnect the Israeli-Palestinian problem from other problems in the region. The more Israel signs normalization agreements with Arab countries, the more the Israeli-Palestinian issue will appear as an isolated bilateral problem and no longer an international one. And my third point, finally, we must note that the Palestinians are deeply weakened by these agreements and that they are in a very bad position to negotiate, therefore, to ask for an improvement of the situation. But there is a risk associated with this disarray, which is that they might be tempted to find regional allies which are more or less anti-Israel. And other risks, like Denis has mentioned, kind of collapse of the Palestinian Authority and new intifada, etc., other possibilities. So all in all, we have to be very cautious. First, we know that this is a key moment, okay? This is a very important moment where many things can change, and we have to work together to try to find a new way to work with the Palestinians. We first, as France now, remain convinced that a sustainable peace in the Middle East cannot be reached without a just, lasting, comprehensive solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Even if I say that there is a kind of disconnection, you can't imagine that at the end of it, the whole region is in peace if you don't find a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What we have seen is Israel's commitment to suspend plans to unilaterally annex areas in the West Bank. For us, we do consider that it is a very positive step, and we think that it should become permanent to maintain the ongoing dynamics, because if not, it will be a kind of snakeback. The problem is that, I don't know in English comment on dit la chaise vide, I mean, the empty chair. If the Palestinians don't want to move and come back to the table to negotiate something, it will be difficult, very difficult, to find a solution. In the Middle East, not to be part of a negotiation is something very difficult because you never win. If you are not at the table of the negotiation, nothing can happen. So what is difficult for the moment is to help resume credible negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians. Okay, that means that there is still a lot to be done, of course, but the new political situation offers opportunity is if every actor decides to act responsibly. Okay, so from the French point of view, we are ready to help as much as we can. We do consider that these new agreements are really going in the good way. It changes things. It's always fine to have a new peace agreement, but we have to continue and make efforts to solve the other issues in the region, and especially the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Danon. Last but not least, Dr. Tal Becker. Tal is the legal advisor of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and a veteran Israeli negotiator. I've had the pleasure of negotiating with him on the same side. Tal, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be with you and the fellow panelists. And thank you to Elnet for organizing this. I will make some comments in my personal capacity, and I'll limit myself just to three big ideas that I want to share. The first, with respect to San Remo itself, I think one of the key important elements of San Remo was the recognition that the idea of Zionism in particular is an idea about collective rights, the collective right of the Jewish people to self-determination. And if we look at the history of the conflict, the San Remo conference essentially developed over time into the idea of partition, recognizing that both the Palestinian collective and the Jewish collective deserved a place on the planet to call their own. And that is really the core rationale behind a lot of policymaking until now, to understand that this is a conflict about collective identities by two peoples, frankly, who have real anxiety about whether their collective identity is seen as legitimate and respected and so on. And I say this first of all because in a minute I'll talk about the very positive developments in the UAE, with the UAE and Bahrain. But I just wanted to kind of mention something that we're hearing from the other direction, from some different circles, that the way to think about this conflict is about individual rights and even discussion of a kind of one state or binational model and so on. I think that when we talk about that frame of the conflict, which you see in different circles, what it misses is the actual lived experience of Israeli Jews and Palestinians in terms of what their actual anxieties and aspirations are. And particularly because I know in an Elnet and a European context, the language of rights and international law is important. I just wanted to flag this one idea that in the in the most important human rights treaty that we have, which is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 1 of that treaty is actually enshrines not an individual human right, but a collective human right. It mentions the right to self-determination as the very first human right. And I think there's a very big idea in that, and that is to understand that human rights include the right of belonging to a collective, include the right of feeling that you are part of a past, a present, and a future. And I think any paradigm that tries to deal with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that disconnects from the idea that this is a conflict of two peoples, two national movements that need a legitimate kind of answer to their concerns and aspirations, misses where I think most Israelis and Palestinians still are. Not that individual rights are not important, but I think that one of the core ideas of San Remo that remains valid today is to understand this conflict through the prism of the collective aspirations of Jews and Palestinians. That's point number one. Point number two, I was very privileged to be involved in the Abraham Accords negotiating and drafting process. And I wanted to say something about that and the kind of paradigm shift that has been mentioned by all the speakers. The first is to say a personal view. I think for most Israelis, the idea that promising normalization in the future, if we resolve the conflict with the Palestinians, was an incentive, frankly, in my experience, wasn't true in 2002 when the Arab Initiative was released, and it wasn't true all the way along. And one of the reasons why it wasn't true was there was too much evidence for the contrary, that it wasn't believable, right? Something I often say when I talk to groups about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is that one of the biggest challenges is not how do you produce change, but how do you generate a belief in the possibility of change. And what's most significant about the breakthroughs with the UAE and Bahrain, and hopefully with other countries, is that we have the opportunity to make change feel believable to Israelis, an atmosphere where that can actually happen. And I think that is a critical component in moving mindsets and psychologies that enable progress, including on the Palestinian track. I don't think anyone who's seriously been involved in this and has, any even approaching the experience of people like Dennis, Mike, and myself in this conflict, anyone is under any illusion that these agreements are a substitute to finding ways to improve and eventually get to a negotiation and a resolution with the Palestinians. But what they critically offer is a way to tell Israelis there are real opportunities in the region that can be expanded and can be developed, and it becomes believable, and it empowers voices within Israeli society that don't need to be committed only to a narrative of siege and defense, but also see possibility. And I think it's important to look at how we might echo that on the Palestinian side. Now, it's much harder to do that on the Palestinian side for a whole host of reasons. But I think the idea that the publics need to believe that change is possible is more important than how do you get to the negotiating room right now. And I wanted to say, given that this is Elnet, that there is a message here, I think, for Europe as well. First of all, to raise a question that if certain Arab countries are basically saying, we are ready to engage and have close relationships with Israel, and we believe that those close relationships in and of themselves are mechanisms through which we can help Israel deal with its problems, I think a lot of Israelis will ask, why wouldn't Europe have that same approach? In other words, not to do this too harsh a linkage between the Palestinian issue and progress, but to actually focus on deep ties, warm relations, intimate relations that themselves produce an ability to persuade much more than the tactics of pressure or loud diplomacy and so on. I think that there's something to be said for that. You know, one of the things I was reminded of as we were negotiating with the Emiratis was that famous Aesop's fable where the wind and the sun compete as to who can take someone's coat off. And the wind blows very hard and says, I'll succeed. And the man just holds on to his coat so much harder. And then the sun comes out and it's warm. and the man feels the need to take off his coat. I think that's a great framework to understand how to speak to Israelis on this issue. And it's worth also mentioning that in my mind, it was always a little bit unnatural for Arab countries to say, we are going to put on hold our individual national interests, our economic interests, for the sake of another issue outside. And that became less and less tenable, as Dennis mentioned, as the national interests rise, as the Iranian threat increased, and frankly, as absolutist and kind of maximalist zero-sum Palestinian positions continued in a way that made it almost nonsensical to continue this posture. The last thing I want to do is a very risky thing, and that's slightly disagree with Dennis. I don't think I can remember doing that only a handful of times, and I'm sure it's temporary until he persuades me that I'm wrong. But I did want to just mention a concern I have about some of the discourse that relates to saying, well, other Arab states could potentially create linkages and say, unless Israel makes, should tie their normalization with concessions that Israel might make to the Palestinians. I think there's room to think carefully about that, because I am worried about one version of that essentially excuses the Palestinians from making any concessions and takes as a given that their maximalist positions can't be moved, and so others need to pay for that price. I worry that that has in it the ingredients of a continuing unhealthy relationship between Israelis and Palestinians that, no matter how difficult it is, have to, at the end of the day, look at each other and make concessions to each other. So I think there's room to explore that when it comes to stabilization and improving conditions. I'm not sure that there's room to explore that very easily in the current political environment when it comes to the big issues that Israelis and Palestinians need to negotiate. And there, Mike, based on the schools of thought that you mentioned, at least at the moment, I tend more to think that the opportunities that will be created by this movement have a more important element of creating openings than any particular policy move or policy linkage. Let's unleash the force of this normalization in ways that can hopefully create opportunities that at the moment we may even not be able to imagine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tal. Let me now ask one follow-up question to each of the speakers. We also have a lot of questions from the audience, and we took note of them and give them a chance later on after we finish this part of the moderated discussion. So let me start with you, Dennis. Since you mentioned the linkage between Israeli-Arab normalization and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and also Tal took issue with some of what you said. So I would like to follow up and ask you, how would you operationalize that? And talking about building a bridge from normalization to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, how do you build a bridge to the Palestinians if they do not desire it?
As Tal said, he and I have had long conversations. Usually we persuade each other, even when we start with different points of departure. So let me explain. Let me address both what he said and also what you asked, Mike, about how to operationalize it. I make an assumption here that there are a number of Arab states, some of which are going to follow along regardless. Clearly, there's discussions with Sudan right now that are a little bit more complicated than most people think, partly because of the divisions between the political and the civilian leadership there, partly because of issues related to what it takes to get them off the terrorism list in the United States. I do believe that these issues will sort themselves out. Their normalization will be along the lines of what we've seen with the UAE and Oman. I'm sorry, and UAE and Bahrain. And I think Oman will also end up, not immediately, but they'll also follow in the same line of doing what is complete normalization. I was raising my issue of linkage first because I didn't create it, the Emiratis created it by linking no annexation to their move to normalization. And others may also say, may raise, don't take the following step and we can proceed. The clear message to the Palestinians is you've lost a veto. I was focused less on the smaller states that I anticipate are going to follow in the footsteps of the UAE and Bahrain. I was focused much more on those other Arab states that are not going to follow in the same way, but may be prepared to take more limited steps along the way. In the case of Morocco, in the case of Saudi Arabia being the country that would be most significant and symbolic, I do not anticipate that they will move in one big leap. And so here I see the value, and actually, Tal, you used the description, you used the word stabilization. I see the value of, let's say, I'll give you an example of what I mean to operationalize this. Let's say the Saudis decide they want to begin to move this process beyond the issue of overflight rights, but they want to do it in a very incremental way, and they don't want to start by official, sort of formal moves that would involve Saudi officials. Let's say Saudis have a number of think tanks. What if the Saudis were to come to the United States and say, we're thinking about, or the United States goes to Saudi Arabia and encourages partial steps. Either we suggest them or they, in the conversation, offer them. An example being, let's say the Saudis would invite a delegation of Israeli think tank people to come to Saudi Arabia and meet with their think tanks. We could have a discussion then of, is there something that Israel could be doing towards the Palestinians that could be helpful? For example, Mike, you know, there are, actually both of you know, there are acute water problems for the Palestinians, obviously in Gaza, but especially in the West Bank too. And these water problems also relate to their agriculture, getting water treatment plants, getting a regional approach to how to deal with wastewater in the West Bank. Here's something that would be felt by Palestinians on the ground, could make a difference in terms of their life. One of the things we should be trying to do, regardless of where the Palestinian leadership is to do what Tal was saying on the Palestinian, apply what he was saying on the Palestinian side, on the Israeli side to the Palestinians. You talked about the need to create a sense of possibility, a belief that something could change. Palestinians need to see something on the ground can also change. Now, some of these can be very functional, like issues of water. There are other things, you know, related to electricity or movement. The point is, see if there's a way for us to broker these kinds of understandings. Now, the question that both of you raised is, what happens if the Palestinians just say no, meaning the leadership just says no? Well, one thing that could be done is some of the Arab states can say, we're moving, we made offers to raise issues with the Israelis for the Palestinians, but the Palestinians weren't prepared to discuss it. There is a need for others to sort of put a spotlight on what the Palestinian leadership is preventing from happening. Now, I'm not saying that's the way you start this process, but there is as the reality moves forward on its own logic right now, there is a need to begin to find different ways to communicate to the Palestinian leadership. That can be done by the Arabs in private, and some of it will inevitably be done in public. This, by the way, is also a very important role for the Europeans. For the Europeans to say there are steps that can be taken, but the Palestinian Authority has to be prepared to engage. By the way, why not have the Europeans talk to the Palestinian Authority about, why don't you develop a menu of steps? Not that there has to be 100%, you know, as we like to say in the Middle East, when you demand everything, you get nothing. So instead of saying, okay, Israel has to completely give up the occupation for anything to happen, that means this reality will unfold without the Palestinians. So one thing the Europeans could do is sit with the Palestinian leadership and say, why don't, either together or on your own, why don't you suggest a menu of options that go from highly functional, pragmatic steps on the ground that could make a difference in the day-to-day reality for Palestinians, which, by the way, would help Palestinian Authority, which has very little legitimacy, largely alienated from its public, in no small reason because the public's perception is Palestinian Authority doesn't care about them. So how about focus on a menu of options that goes from highly practical, highly functional, and they can be a gradation that become more symbolic or political over time. For the bigger the move, there can be a push for some moves from the Israelis. The reality is, if following the logic of what Tal said, the more Arab states are showing the Israeli public that in fact there is its acceptance of the collective Israeli identity and its right to be there. One of the big things that has had to change, and for the Israeli public to see, is not that they're simply accepted as a fact. For so long, the Arab position was, we accept Israel, they're a reality, but they never accepted the legitimacy of Israel being there. And the more these relationships demonstrate they accept the legitimacy, the more it changes the climate in terms of what is possible, in terms of Israeli public attitudes. So in a sense, that's why I say the Arabs can provide a bridge. And the irony is the bridge is for both Israelis and Palestinians alike.
Okay, let me now turn to Ambassador Danon, and I have a question to you. When you talk to Israeli officials, I think this was also echoed by Minister Farkash-Hacohen, you hear criticism on Europe as if Europe is not exactly on the right side of history, stuck somewhere in the past, that when you look at the new realities in the Middle East, Israeli-Arab normalization, while you welcome it, at the same breath, you immediately talk about Israeli-Palestinian negotiations as if you look at it through the Israeli-Palestinian prism. And I could go on and on. I think it was reflected here. How do you answer this critique? You are muted. You are muted.
Okay, that's it?
Yes.
Okay. No, but it's not totally right, welcoming the Abraham agreements, we just listened the reason put on the table by the Emirates themselves, which was to stop or delay the annexation. So we did not make the link. And today, if you listen to the Arab statements at the UN General Assembly, they all make the link. So it's not a question of Europe out of, history or something like that. It's a question of something has changed because the Arabs themselves have broken the doctrine of 2002, saying there will not be normalization till there is an end or the beginning of a solution in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We just had to take note of that. So if we say this has not solved the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, of course it's obvious. And is there a link? The first which made the link were the Arab countries themselves. Okay, we did not make a link. We say, don't forget the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And they made a link, which is different. Okay, so just to be sure that we are the same. Now, what to do with the Palestinians themselves? I said before, and everybody said, they are in a very weak position today. And we try to do three things. First, explaining how we consider that the situation has changed, because it has changed. And it's not so obvious that in the territories, everybody thinks that the situation has changed with new opportunities. Second, we have to show them all the interest there is in coming back to the negotiation table. And we did that all the time. The key the key issue when we talk to the Palestinians, say, go back to the table. Maybe the third issue is that we are working with people of goodwill on both sides, because you have the authorities and you have the civil societies. And many things are happening in the new generation on both sides and in the civil societies. So that's it. If you ask me what to do, we are saying but we are not going to negotiate for the Palestinians. It's a bilateral issue. And we just are on the line to say, you have to take into account the new situation and go back to the negotiation table. Now, what will be the end of the story? Nobody knows. 1 state, 2 states, 0 state, nobody knows. But what we would prefer, and we do consider that that would be the good solution, is still a 2-state solution, etc., etc. You know the French position. Does that mean that we should not agree on something else? Not at all. We can accept every solution if Palestinians and Israelis do agree on this solution. If they don't agree, how could we say this is the good solution? They have to agree. So this is really first a bilateral negotiation. Then we can say that is what we do prefer, and we think that the good solution would be this or that. But if they do agree on something else, then it's okay for us, by definition. Okay, that's it.
Thanks. Finally, before we move to the audience, one question to you, Tal. And I'm here referring to you in your legal hat. When we talk to Europeans about the conflict, the first thing they say is international law. And they have their own interpretation of international law as it pertains to the conflict. The 67 territories are occupied and so on. Israel has a different, policy, disputed territories and so on. By the way, talking about 100 years to San Remo, this is about a different position. How do you factor in the legal dimension into a political conflict? And is there only one interpretation to international law on this?
And just say some general points. The first thing I think to say is that international law is not the tax code, especially when it comes to these issues. It's not like you fill in a yellow form or a pink form and you know the answer. In this conflict, every fact is in dispute, every law is in dispute, and the application of every law to every fact is in dispute. And if you look at the way in which international law is used in the conflict, essentially both sides use the language of law to validate their own story, to validate their own narrative, and very rarely to actually legitimize or create space for the other side to agree. And I want to just say that generally speaking, international law, in my view, needs to be thought of as a language, as a kind of reference point, where if you use it well, you can create a common, somewhat dispassionate way of talking about issues that can resonate with legitimacy for both sides. Maybe another way to say this is that, let's think very basically, how do you get to agreement? How do you get people to agree in any kind of negotiation? Very few people are admonished or insulted into agreement. It just doesn't happen that way. And if they are insulted or admonished or kind of pointed to, you're wrong, I'm right, into agreement, the agreement tends not to last very long. So what happens when you talk to an Israeli with a version of international law that is maybe a plausible argument that has support in many places, and you tell them you're wrong and we're right, what you end up doing is creating a defensive reaction. And you can do the same on the Palestinian side. So I think that international law, when the lawyers help in the room, and I'd like to think that I'm one of the lawyers who tries to help in the room, they do what Eliakim Rubinstein used to call finding solutions to problems rather than finding problems with solutions. And that means that they're constantly trying to find language that each side somehow can have a victory speech through that language, rather than this kind of zero-sum contest. We have a lot of that in this conflict because both sides, I think, are in a kind of trauma about their situation. And they use international law as a kind of weapon in that way. A great example of this is the International Criminal Court, right? The injection of the International Criminal Court in this process essentially criminalizes the conflict. It says, let me tell you what the story of this conflict is. There's a victim and there's a villain. And the way we're going to resolve this conflict is to hold the villain accountable. Yes, and to defend the villain. That version of looking at the conflict pulls people away. It is the exact opposite of the opportunity created by the UAE-Bahrain agreement. What we try to do in a negotiation is to make each side recognize that they can create space for the other's legitimacy without it being a threat to themselves. And that requires the kind of law and the kind of lawyers that recognize that they're using a language and not using some kind of dictate or fiat to the other side. And I think that's really important. On any given issue, Mike, and we won't do it now, I can present an argument for the validity of the Israeli position that I think will be hard to disagree with for lots of people. And you know what, if I push myself, I can probably do it on some of the Palestinian points as well. But that's not going to move us forward. And I think if we look at the dynamics in the region and what is critical to moving forward, it is getting away from this kind of zero-sum game and creating those kind of opportunities and ways to imagine our future differently to our past, which is why these agreements with Bahrain and the UAE are so important.
Thank you, Tal. We'll now move to the Q&A part of this event. We have many questions from the audience, and I'll give the floor by sequence of questions. Let me start with Renaud Girard from Le Figaro.
Thank you very much for this conference. I regret that the minister, after delivering her speech, left, because I had a question to ask her, but maybe other speakers could answer my question, is how much of the territory of the mandatory Palestine, the one that was settled in 1923, after the separation from Palestine and Transjordania, what is the percentage of this territory that the current Israeli government would be ready to give to the Palestinians so that they can build a viable state if the two-state solution is still considered in Israel? I understood that the Oslo Agreement and the negotiation after the Oslo Agreement.
Could you please keep your question short? We are short of time.
22% of the territory of mandatory Palestine. How much this government is, how much of the territory of mandatory Palestine that is totally controlled by Israel today, the current government would be ready to give for a viable Palestinian state? This is my question.
Okay, I don't think we have an Israeli official who can answer your question either here or out there. I don't think anybody will discuss that in public. All I can tell you, based on my experience with Tal and Dennis as well, that in the last round of negotiations we held with the Palestinians in 2014, the agreed upon principle was that the territories are, the reference line is 67 lines with agreed territorial swaps. That's as much as you can get, I believe, at this phase. Let me move on to Harold Hyman from CN News. I believe you have a question. Unmute yourself, please.
Mute.
But if you can just keep your question short.
Yeah, very short. So often I hear from the Israeli side that it is the press and the media who are misguiding the millions and millions of people into being pro-Palestinian here. I don't really buy much of that, but don't you see that there's a big block of opinion in Europe which really thinks the Palestinians are the victims? How do you expect to engage with them to move the Europeans to a more sympathetic position on Israel?
Who wants to answer that? Tal would like to say a word, or Dennis?
I mean,
Yeah.
I can perhaps try a little. You identify a very important problem because I do think that so much of the discourse around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is almost a kind of competition about victimhood, right? I've heard it called the oppression Olympics, right? And each side essentially tries to talk about how much they are a victim in order to determine what should be done, as if the only way you can think about this conflict is by picking sides as who in the victim, and that determines the outcome. Parts of the reason for why that is attractive have nothing to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict per se. They have to do with European history. They have to do with a commitment to human rights, with a commitment to the underdog, with a whole bunch of psychological things that I'm not sure is an easy thing for a simple amount of talking points or PR to address. The thing I try to do when I speak to audiences is not just try to complicate the way this conflict is perceived by understanding how Israelis and Palestinians see the conflict, but by pointing out that this attempt to essentially break the conflict down into a villain-victim story is one of the key ways of perpetuating it. Because what happens, paradoxically, is when Israel is portrayed as the villain, Israelis feel victimized by that. They become more persuaded that they are the victim because there is not enough sympathy for their situation in the region. And what happens when Palestinians are perceived as the victim in Europe is that you tend to empower this sense that nothing is expected of the Palestinians, that there aren't demands of them. And what you end up doing is kind of polarizing each side and incentivizing each side to speak not in the language of what are our responsibilities and what can we do to move forward, but in the language of what is owed to me. And I think that for those at least who want Israeli-Palestinian process to move forward, abandoning that kind of commitment to victimhood is absolutely critical. That's why I made that point about the ICC. But to the questioner, I would simply say that it's one thing to tell you what to do or to suggest what to do. It's quite another thing to suggest how to do it and how it actually can have an impact, because the challenge is very significant.
Well, thank you very much. Next question, I believe Aryeh Ben Simon, who is the head of Elnet's office in France, has a question.
Yes,
Aryeh.
yes, thank you very much. My question is for Eric Danon. So you said, Mr. Ambassador, that there is a new reality and a new dynamic in the Middle East. But my question is, what can France and perhaps also Europe too do to support this development and push the Palestinians to join the negotiation table and not practice, as you said, the empty chair policy, which would be, by the way, disastrous for them and also for the global peace in the region. Isn't it high time to free yourself from inoperative and outdated mantra and parameters? And if so, what do you think should be France's contribution, which should not remain a spectator? Because you said negotiation, but at the same time, we know that the European and the French diplomacy is still stick to the old parameters, we say, lines of 67, Jerusalem as capital of the two states, and so on and so forth. Isn't it the time to stop with that and to say to the Palestinians, take the opportunity and go to negotiation? So what France could do to push Palestinians to negotiate? What could be the contribution of France?
Okay.
Yes.
Yes. So I think I answered previously to that question. We have to show the Palestinians that they have to come back to the table, that they have to negotiate, to take into account the new situation, etc., etc. And this is, you are talking about the old mantras, etc. First, it's not a French one. It comes from the international community. And believe me, the resolutions in the UN are the UNSC, the Security Council resolutions. You have to take them into account. If not, you have other kinds of problems. Okay, that doesn't mean, once again, that things will not change. They are going to change. Of course, that's exactly what we are saying today. The things are changing. Okay, are we part of the negotiation with the Palestinians between Israelis and Palestinians? No, we are not. So the only thing that we can say to the Palestinians, go back to negotiate. Now, do we have a final? No, come on, Ariel. We have to say, we are not part of the negotiation. So we can only say to the negotiators, go back to the table. That's the first point. To negotiate what? What they do want. Once again, the international community years ago proposed and said in resolutions, that's what we think is the best solution for this negotiation. Okay, now I can tell you that according to the new situation, if Israelis and Palestinians find another solution and that they both agree on that, that will be totally different. Is that thinkable? Okay, 6 months ago, nobody could have said that Israel and the Emirates were going to sign the Abraham agreements. So that means, and 6 months ago, you could not have imagined that. So it's not a question of mantras, it's not a question of this or that. It is a question of the situation has changed because the Middle East has totally changed, because of the position of the United States, because of Iran, because of Turkey, because of Israel becoming a new regional power, because of the fatigue vis-à-vis the Palestinian issue, etc. Everything is moving. Okay, that means that we have to take that into account. But once again, we are not part of the negotiation itself. So if they want to negotiate something else, they can do that. Our role is to say, first, go back to the table. And second, we do consider that the best solution would be this one. Do you have a better solution than this one? Maybe you have one in your head and you can put it on the table. What I can say is that everybody which puts another solution on the table shows that there are other problems. Okay, only one state, 2 states, not Jerusalem, the problem of refugees, we know all of that. And I like what Mr. Becker said about the way to negotiate. And then I could add something else about the negotiation between East and West Germany. I was part of that in the French delegation. The sentence of Jean Monnet, I think, always think about reunification, never talk about it. That means that if you begin by the end, I mean the solution, the 2-state solution or the 1-state solution or whatever, you have a problem because today, as a symbol, they are a non-starter of the negotiations. To begin the negotiation, you must begin with something else. First, small steps, as it has been said, small steps to change the situation on the ground of the people. And then maybe another situation, another possibility or the final solution will appear. But for the moment, what I can say is that as the negotiations are on the table, it does not work. So I do agree that we have to change that. Is this our role to change the final issue? No. Once again, we are not part of the negotiation. We are part of the countries which can support any bilateral negotiation between Israel and the Palestinians. Okay?
Thank you. Next question, Dan Diker from JCPOA. I know you have more than one question, but we have time for one, so please choose your question.
Thank you very much, General Herzog. Appreciate it, Brigadier General Herzog. This would be for Ambassador Ross. It would be a combo question. I've read all of your books, and as you know, I've followed all of your counsel over the years. And I wanted to ask if, in fact, as you open your remarks in 2007, we saw a lot of evidence that the Arab states were moving away from the Palestinian issue and primarily concerned with Iranian nuclearizing ascension and hegemony in the Middle East. Why is it that you and other most leading DC experts on the Middle East, and as well as Bush 43 and President Obama, primarily hyper-focused on the Palestinian issue, taking a completely different tack than the UAE and Bahrain has taken now?
Well, first, if you actually read all my books, if you go back to Doomed to Succeed, the U.S.-Israeli relationship from Truman to Obama, one of the things I highlighted is what the Arab leader real priorities were. And the priorities were never the Palestinians. They might use the Palestinian issue, but it was never the priority for them. And what I was suggesting even then, and especially at the beginning of the Trump administration, but even before, was how can we better work with the Arabs, try to change the situation, not as a substitute for the Palestinians, because they cannot substitute for the Palestinians, but could they provide cover for the Palestinians? I wrote about this idea 10 years ago. Could they provide cover for the Palestinians? Could there be a relationship that where they could, in a sense, be the vehicle to make it easier for the Palestinians to make certain kinds of concessions? Would there be ways to take the Arab Peace Initiative and transform it? Something that Tal said very early on. The Arab Peace Initiative of 2002 basically offered Israel a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. But there was nothing in the behavior at the time that suggested that real peace was likely because the was so different. I was pushing to see, can you give content to that? Could you begin to have Israeli and Arab conversations, for example, on one of the principles of the Arab Peace Initiative, which is security assurances to both sides? What would they look like? So I, at least for one, was trying to push this along without a whole lot of success. Now you put your finger on something, it's true. Condi's focus, even after that GCC meeting in 2007, still was to believe that you had to deal with the Palestinian issue. Clearly that was the case for much of the Obama administration. To be fair to them, what they were hearing from Arab leaders when they would talk to them about it was not a focus on the Palestinian issue as a priority, but whenever the issue was raised, they basically wouldn't offer much. They would say, you need to talk to the Palestinians. They have to decide. So one thing that has changed is the Arab behavior. Even if they had a different set of priorities before, the way they interacted with the United States was to say, look, whatever the Palestinians will agree to, we will agree to. So they weren't prepared to assume a responsibility along the lines that we now see. Number one. And number two, what you saw with the UAE was this decision that there is too much to be gained not to be prepared to cross this threshold. And I think one of the things to bear in mind is with COVID-19 and the economic implications for it in the region, with climate change and drought becoming an increasingly difficult problem, creating acute water shortages, you have two areas where the pressures on Arab governments is going to go up, and they will need to be able to show they can respond to these needs. Now, Israel becomes a natural partner in that circumstance. So in some ways, part of the reason I think for the change was not just the pressure of annexation. Part of the change was recognizing there are going to be new realities in this region that pose greater challenges for Arab governments. The issue of governance itself will be much more prominent. Their own citizens, their own public may be more inclined to put pressure on them. All these things, I think, came together to produce what is a different approach right now. Now, it's not true for all Arab states at this point, but the fact is, in a sense, a threshold was crossed, a psychological threshold was crossed. And it will make it easier for others to say, okay, we have to pursue our own national interests. We're not interested in forsaking the Palestinians, but the Palestinians also have to be prepared to do something for themselves. And I would just add one last thought. Over the course, I would say, of the last 5 or 6 years, when I would travel to the Gulf, I would hear something very different than I heard before. And that was increasing fatigue with the Palestinian issue and increasing frustration with the Palestinians themselves for being unable to adopt anything but their traditional positions.
Let me now turn to Dr. Toby Green from Bar-Ilan University. Toby, please.
Thank you so much, Mike. It may be that Tal is best equipped to answer this. I'm interested in my own research about the role that civilizational identities play and how civilizational identities are used for political purposes. And I'm interested in this particular case, why these agreements were branded or framed as the Abraham Accords. I'm curious as to whose idea it was to give them that framing or branding, and what their motivation was for giving it that religious, cultural, or civilizational context or branding. Thanks so much.
Tal, before you answer, since you're part of drafting these accords, if you can a bit expand on what you see different in these agreements compared to past agreements Israel negotiated and signed. The deep layer. You are muted.
Yes, that's okay. Thank you, Toby and Mike. So, I mean, when I give talks to groups, I used to say that my resume is just a list of failures because I've drafted a lot of agreements but never had any of them signed. And this was the first one that I've been involved in. I think that, I mean, I've done a few things that have been signed, but nothing in the conflict space. So just to refer to Mike's point, first of all, I've often found, and I think Dennis and Mike might echo this, that in some of the negotiations, the lawyers are brought into the room to help the politicians not make decisions. In other words, to choose words and language and kind of drafts which never really, make that breakthrough. And there very often is, because of so much of the baggage and emotional kind of weight and scars of the past that are associated with negotiations with our closer neighborhood, it's actually very, very difficult for those big decisions to be made. And I've often found the lawyers are there sometimes to help the decisions not be made rather than to be made. And for me, what the most refreshing part of the negotiations with the UAE were in particular was you basically had two countries who really wanted this to happen. I found in my Emirati colleagues the same degree of enthusiasm. None of this kind of suspicion. And, very often you'll find in the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, for example, that there's this internal group discussion. Well, what do they really want? What's behind this demand and so on. There was something refreshingly kind of positive and transparent about this process. If you look at the text of the agreement itself, in core respects, it's really just a bilateral agreement about how two countries want to improve the lives of their citizens and want to maximize the potential that they have. The UAE is a startup Arab nation, very much in the way that Israel is a startup nation and sees themselves as such. And there are such great opportunities for partnership. There's obviously potential for the region. And it was simply that kind of energy with a really very, very important and significant help from the US that kind of helped generate this. But as Dennis mentioned also, frankly, also over 20 years of below the radar dialogue and connections, that for someone like me who has had some involvement in that, this felt like a natural thing, not a surprising thing. It was kind of a question of, it was always a question of when and not if, and it kind of developed in a natural way. On Toby's specific question, with respect, Toby, I won't tell you whose idea it was and how that played out, but I will say something, because I think we need to respect the way in which these things develop. But I will say something about the importance of the idea of Abraham and the relevance of the reference in the agreement to Jewish and Arab peoples in particular. First, to say that both Bahrain and the UAE give a lot of weight to the idea of religious coexistence. They have for a long time, and they really themselves were keen to talk about the ways in which these agreements could be engines for religious coexistence, including there's an entire section in the UAE-Israel Peace Treaty that deals with the promotion of the culture of peace and coexistence in quite concrete ways. And there's a lot of energy behind that at the moment. From an Israeli perspective, I frankly think that one of the most important paragraphs in the agreement is actually in the preamble, which recognizes that both the Arab and Jewish peoples are descendants of a common ancestor. And for an Israeli Jewish public that is so used to delegitimization, including in the Islamic religious context, where the idea of a Jewish people and the Jewish indigenousness in this region that are belonging to this region is natural and necessary, that is something that is resisted in very significant parts of the Arab and Muslim world, very resisted in Palestinian society as well. And for this agreement to kind of naturally refer to the idea that both Jews and Arabs belong to the region and both Jews and Arabs need to work together, I think is a really, really important pushback against that. And I hope that it will spread across the region. So there is an element of branding in calling it the Abraham Accords, which you can treat lightly if you like. But I think there is real significance in pushing back against the kind of rejectionism that has made it so difficult for coexistence to kind of be promoted and advanced in the region.
Thanks, Tal. We basically ran out of time, but I will take 2 more minutes to allow for one final question. Mr. Smales from the Office of the US Security Coordinator and the British team, if you could ask your question.
Thank you. In mid-May, security administration coordination stopped between the Israelis and the Palestinian Authority. In mid-June, both Israel and the Palestinians started to see a substantial increase in COVID-19. And Ambassador Ross has already talked about the sort of regional issues, climate change, COVID being amongst them. We've heard other speakers talk about the importance of mutual benefit in terms of kickstarting a process. From where I'm sitting, I do not believe that either Israel or the Palestinians will resolve the COVID problem without a regional approach. And I just wonder whether this might provide the impetus which is needed to regenerate the communications between the two sides. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I will give each one of you like 1 minute to conclude and respond to this question as well. Dennis, please. Unmute.
If COVID tells us anything, it reminds us that there are issues that don't respect borders and don't treat people as being anything except being human. And if we cannot take advantage of those challenges that basically are challenges to humanity, then there are very few challenges on which we should be able to take advantage of. So I do see this as an area where something has to be done. And therefore, if it is done, it can be used to be helpful potentially in broader areas.
Ambassador Danon. Unmute. Please unmute yourself.
Yes, okay. No, thank you for this fascinating debate. I must say that really, once again, we are at a very, very important moment of time. And that it's not because the new dynamic, the new paradigm is for all of us something enthusiastic, something that has to be implemented, and we are in favor of new agreements of Israel with other Arab countries. That is not a reason to abandon, to not to try to solve the remaining conflict. And I hope that what is said today, that these new agreements can give a new way to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is true, which is not so obvious. But if it is the case, then we can say that once again, history is really changing today, and something extremely important is happening. That's all.
Tal, final word is yours.
Yes. Oh, thank you. So, you know, we're not only marking 100 years since San Remo. In a year's time, we'll be marking 30 years to the Madrid framework, which I think only Dennis is a veteran of. Mike, if I'm not mistaken. One of the interesting things about the Madrid process was the attempt to identify regional issues which could move in parallel to bilateral issues in terms of environment and water and other concerns. You know, we're at such a polarized and partisan moment in so many countries that sometimes the hope that Dennis described feels somehow unreal and unreachable. And it's so self-defeating, because after all, we are only hurting ourselves by not being able to cooperate. And I would like, I think, to us to be able to move in that direction simply by recognizing that one of the human needs we have is to recognize the legitimacy of collective identity. And if we can recognize that, we can also move beyond it to cooperate on things that cross those collective lines. And so I bring it back to San Remo in the sense that it really did enshrine this idea of giving legitimacy to collective identity, because once you can give it legitimacy, you can also transcend it and deal with issues like COVID and environment and so on, which is basically begging for this kind of cooperation.
Thank you, Tal. This concludes our event. I believe it was fascinating and enriching. And I want to thank everybody for participating, especially our speakers for doing an excellent job. Everybody who participated, asked questions and contributed. Thank you all. Stay healthy and see you soon.